about this extraordinary film. I'm a little obsessed. The film is Crack, Cocaine, Corruption, and Conspiracy. And my name is Maria Hinojosa. You may know me. Well, I'm an immigrant. I got a lot of jobs, but you may know me from anchoring and executive producing Latino USA. Sometimes you see me on MSNBC. I just wrote a book. That's what I'm really focusing on right now, apart from the nonprofit media company that I run, Futuro Media, the other political podcast I do, In the Thick. The book I just wrote is Once I Was You, a memoir of love and hate in a torn America. And part of the book actually really deals with the part of the subject of this film. And I am just so thrilled and honored, one, to be asked to be here with you, but to be joined by the amazing Stanley Nelson, who is the producer and director of this film. What's up, Stanley? To his partner, Marcia Smith, the executive producer of this film. What up, Marcia? My friends. Congress member Karen Bass from California, chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Hello, hello. On this auspicious night, we are recording this on January 13th. The Congresswoman has just voted for a second time to impeach the president of the United States of America, the only time in history that's happened. So, that is the night that we're recording. And I'm really thrilled also to be joined by Samson Stiles. He's in the film and he's a consulting producer. And I just want to say, Stanley and Marcia, thank you so much for making this film. I don't know, right now you're going to tell us how long it was in the making, how long you were thinking about making this film. But I just think that seeing this film right now, when we are in the midst of yet another reckoning that really centers around lies and really centers also around the dramatic inequality of how people of color, Black people, Latinos, people of color, Indigenous people, are treated in this country and the lies that are afforded to them. So congratulations. It's just gripping, and I want part 2, part 3, part 4. I'm really, like, I just wanna see more. So thank you, and thank you to Netflix for bringing on such an extraordinary filmmaking team. So how far back does it go, Stanley? How far back was it, or was it Marsha, who was like, "You know what we gotta do? We gotta do this film about this."
Yeah, I mean, we were talking to Netflix for a pretty long time about different projects, and we came up. We really said, hey, what about crack? It was like a one-word pitch. What about crack? And everybody around the table was like, yeah, yeah. That we never have really examined it. There was a lot of hyperbole at the time, a lot of press at the time, a lot of overblown press, but we felt like nobody had kind of looked at it. Through the lens of history, and that we really got a chance to do that with this film. It took about a year to make the film, maybe a little more.
Marcia, when the word crack came out, and you are an executive producer, kind of what goes behind making a film like this, you probably said, wow, exactly, we need, or what was your reaction?
Yeah, I mean, and it was really Stanley's idea, to give him credit for that. I think, yeah, for once. It's a period of history that is not that long ago. It's still very much with us. And I think with all that we've gone through in the last few years, all the awareness that has been surfaced about mass incarceration, about the difference with the opioid epidemic, all of these things, many of these things have their roots in this era that we're now, some of us of a certain age, we can say, well, that's now history. We lived through that, and at the time, as the case with many things, you don't realize that you're kind of in the swarm of this huge moment that is going to really mean something for decades down the road. But that's what it really was.
Samson, Marcia uses the word swarm. You were in the swarm. And your voice is just so important in the film because you are giving us context. You are taking us there. So when you get approached to be involved, one as a subject and having to reveal certain things about your life in that moment, having to deal with crack, and then also to be, talked about as a consulting producer. Were you just like, wait, what just happened here? What was your reaction?
No, it definitely was a wow moment because I got contacted by one of the producers that Stanley Nelson, that's under him, that basically taught me a lot of the ropes that I know now as a journalist. So he knows my background, and when he called me to actually be interviewed, I was like that was a no brainer. I'm like, crack, like, okay, So when the producer was questioning me, and we had a pre-interview, she said, wow, I didn't know it was this intricate, like the details. So I said, I love to come on and be more than an interviewer. I mean, be more than just get interviewed if everyone is cool with it. So I guess she ran it up the ladder, and Keith Brown brought it to Stanley and Marsha, and they said, okay, let's bring him on as a consultant. And then from there, they gave me a lot of room to be able to tell the intricate details of the street portions, the emotions, and just the things that go on that usually wouldn't be told.
Yeah, and we can talk a little bit more in a minute about the street capitalism that we were all witnessing, and really the brain power and energy of so many people of color that was being used on the streets and not recognized for its potential. But, Congresswoman, what we do also see in this film, and it's something, again, we all lived through it, so we know it's real. But for many other generations, it's going to be like, hold on, hold on, hold on. The U.S. government was involved in all of this, and they'll become familiar with Nicaragua and the Contras and Oliver North. The whole revelation that we all knew because we lived through it around corruption. How does that sit with you as a lawmaker, knowing what we know now?
Well, first of all, I just have to thank Stanley and Marsha again for your contributions to this country are just immense, and I just love that you chose to focus on this. I was absolutely obsessed behind crack when this started. And to me, it was obviously a health problem and it was an economic problem, and we criminalized it. So what was also happening at the time was deindustrialization. We lost a lot of jobs. They weren't replaced with anything. I remember Newsweek doing an article saying that crack was an equal opportunity employer. We knew those drugs were coming in from overseas. But to me, the thing about it is that it was devastating the community, because the other thing that was happening at the same time was AIDS. And we didn't know how it was transmitted. There wasn't the cocktail. And so people were dying from the violence, they were dying from overdosing, and they were dying from AIDS because of the sexual behavior associated with the drug. And what was so deep is it was the first time in our history that women became addicted equal to men. That had not happened before. We had nothing in our society that was ready for it. Prisons weren't ready for it. We didn't have drug treatment designed for women. And so you had a confluence of problems, but the community did respond because the community did know it was a health issue. And a lot of us joined together and fought for drug treatment. At that point in time, I would have never imagined myself a member of Congress because I was too busy fighting what was happening in Congress with the drug laws. But when the drug laws were happening, you also saw those laws on a state level and on a local level too.
Which means there's a whole conversation also that's part of this film that is about the community participation, right? That we have to take our communities, right? And I love that whole moment when the community is confronting the director of the CIA and holding them accountable. So let's talk a little bit about the division of the chapters, Stanley. And before we get to corruption, can we talk a little bit about, because you're a filmmaker, I'm a journalist, our colleagues in the news media do not come out looking so good at all. You know what I think about that, but I want to know what you think about that and the importance of, pulling back and looking and analyzing it, how journalists, our contemporaries, were handling the situation with crack.
I mean, I think, it changed over time and it went through a lot of different phases. But I think at first, they were just ignoring it. I mean, it was, for people who weren't there during the crack era, you have to understand that it was being sold out on the streets. I mean, you couldn't even walk down the streets in many neighborhoods, Black and Latinx neighborhoods, without, kind of pushing people aside that were selling and smoking crack. I remember walking down the street right around the corner from my house, and they were smoking crack, in a bunch of different doorways. It was just so obvious that something was happening and something different was happening, and it wasn't being covered in the press at all. Then, as we talk about it in the film, when the press got hold of it, they kind of went crazy, and just talked craziness, and we show some of the clips in the film, a reporter who will go nameless talking, holding a little baby and saying that the woman was so cracked up that she didn't even know she delivered a baby until 2 days later. Now, I don't want to speak for women, but I mean, but any woman can tell you that you can't, give birth to a baby without knowing it. And so it was just craziness. We talk about another woman who was actually arrested and at first convicted for dealing crack to her baby in the 60 seconds before they cut the umbilical cord.
The level of dehumanization that we can now look at with a certain amount of distance, I think, is going to be the same level of dehumanization that people will look at this particular moment. And Stanley, it's true. I remember, I lived on a street on 106th Street and Columbus Avenue. It was known as Crack Alley.
Yeah.
It was known as Crack Alley.
Yeah.
People standing in line at 9 o'clock in the morning. But interestingly enough, and I know you guys are going to be just like, what? It was 1985. I had just moved to Washington, D.C. I had just taken a job at NPR. And someone who worked there came to my apartment as a friend and said, "Hey, I was new. I was a kid. Said, "Hey, I'm going to come visit you." I didn't have any friends. I said, "Sure, And he started cooking crack in the kitchen. And I didn't know exactly what was happening, but I freaked out. And then, he wouldn't leave. And it got really, really scary.
Yeah.
But it also made it very real for me, right? This was a human being that I had witnessed this experience. Samson, can you talk a little bit about what it was like, what it is like for you now, having lived through the multiple eras of crack and its expression, either on the streets or with the police or dealing or being with people who were getting high or getting high? What is it like for you to kind of see it now in this historical documentary?
To see it in this historical documentary and know that I played a part in telling this story is therapeutic on many levels, because the after effect of knowing that you helped poison this community and was a profiteer and was at one time looking for the weakness in people, looking for someone to get turned out that had the money so that you could come up off of them. And now, coming to the realization of how much damage was done, like how many lives were the communities just destroyed. It didn't get all into it in the documentary, but, a lot of things had to be cut out. But I mean, all over the states, the profiteering, like moving from states because it was getting too congested. and it was, everybody was hustling and trying to. So now we break out and go to the south and causing havoc wherever we went. Wherever we went, we damaged the communities. So just looking back at it now, a lot of it is shame when I look at the doc, and then I'm desensitized in a lot of ways too, because used to seeing so much death and just destruction, and it kind of numbs you because that was your way of life for so long, and now you have a clear perception of what you was doing, and so it's an emotional roller coaster when I watch it.
For us too, and we're so glad that you made it to this side of things. We really, really are. And what you say, Samson, this notion of looking for weakness it's really hard to kind of reveal that, but that is what your job was. Congresswoman, for the people who haven't seen the film yet, it begins to sound a little bit crazy what was going on, because you're talking about money, arms being sold to Iran, and then profit from that sales to Iran, which was illegal, was then being used to support counter-revolutionaries from actually opposing a legit revolutionary movement in Nicaragua. And then along the way, and there are several now Hollywood films that kind of capture this moment, or if you're watching Escobar, I watched the Colombian version of Pablo Escobar's story, you see then the connection of selling drugs in our communities, supported in fact by the US government. So give people here, we're talking about hate, and there's going to be a lot of hate in that moment when they're looking at what the American government did in relationship to crack in our communities. So talk us down.
I'm not sure that I can talk you down, but I do think in the African American community, though, I mean, what's new? I don't think that this was the volume, the type of drug, the way it addicted you so quickly was very different. But I think in the African American community, I mean, in terms of how people view the government, people don't view the government as there to help them. Certainly don't view the police that's there to help them. In Los Angeles, we had a really crazy police chief who did Operation Hammer. In the movie, you show the battering ram where they would just smash through people's houses. And Operation Hammer, every weekend they went and they grabbed people and they had mass arrests. But, when I was listening to you talk about preying on the community, one of the things that we did when we tried to organize the community, because what we wanted to do is we wanted to shift the agenda away from looking at this as a criminal problem and looking at it as what it was, which was a health and an economic problem. And so we went to people who were addicted, who were in recovery, because so many people who were in recovery wanted to repay the community, felt that they had harmed the community, just as you described. But that energy, when it turns into its opposite, it's ferocious. And those people are extremely committed to, essentially repairing the damage that they had done. And until you get policymakers to look at it different and say what the community needed, like Susan Burton so eloquently described, why didn't you send me to a treatment center? If I have diabetes, you're not going to put me in jail, although we do that with people who are mentally ill now, right? You send me to a treatment program. And so it's hard to talk you down from the government side when we have such examples of how government has harmed us in so many ways over so many different generations.
Yeah, and Susan Burton making her plea. By the way, Susan Burton, who did serve years in prison, and now works with women in California in terms of transitioning, coming out of prison, and making a life for themselves as opposed to just being thrown out onto the streets. But her question was, couldn't you see that I was suffering?
Right.
Couldn't you see that I was suffering and that I needed help? And now in the whole opioid epidemic, it is, oh my gosh, how people are suffering now, how sad that they are suffering. And it is being treated less as a criminal issue than as a than as a public health concern. But Stanley, I want to, and if you're interested, Marcia, too. So, yeah, I mean, in particular, having lived in New York during this time, it was a crazy time. Samson knows, Marcia and Stanley, it was a crazy time. There was a lot of politics. I mean, Central America was happening. Anti-apartheid movement was happening. Things were really intense. I remember being on 9th Street downtown in the Lower East Side, 9th and I think Avenue C, B, something like that. And the traffic along the street was exactly what you showed in the film. I mean, it was extraordinary. I just remember looking out, and it was 4 o'clock in the morning, and the coordination level. And I was just like, what a loss of not understanding that this is, in fact, street capitalism. And there is so much business savvy that is happening here. How do we change that conversation? And you really deal with that in the film. Can you talk a little bit about what that part of it was like? Because a lot of these, there was a lot of savvy that was happening too that got lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the differences between crack and Samson can jump in because he was right in the middle of it. But one of the differences between crack and the heroin trade, and other drugs before that was that there, there was no kind of mafia that controlled it. That you could buy some cocaine and cook it up and get out on the corner and bag it up and sell and be an entrepreneur and sell crack. We have a great sequence in there that it's actually really funny where Samson talks about how the only job that he could get was McDonald's and how for flipping burgers finally the take home pay was nothing. And his friend comes to him and says, hey, sell this stuff. They're going crazy. And he starts selling crack and starts making real money. And so, wow, this is something that I can do and make real money. And so that people like Samson and really young people, were controlling the trade in neighborhoods. And again, it kind of progressed until it really lethal for so many people.
The other interesting things to me that we really struggled to get in there was the role of a lot of Black elected officials at the time. There were people like Karen, and I know the organization that Karen started, Congresswoman Bass started, that took that public health view that you have to see it in the context of health and the economy and the choices that people have. But for so many quote unquote leadership people and elected officials, there was a failure of imagination. And when confronted with a real crisis that was really accelerating, was really hurting people, if the only thing we can come up with is criminal justice response to that, then you get what we got.
Yeah, that was definitely seeing Charlie Rangel kind of talk about it. What did he say? It sounded like a good idea at the moment. It sounded like a good idea at the time, and it's just like, and you're right. It was truly a failure of imagination. Congresswoman, you didn't have that failure of imagination. You were, in fact, trying to change the narrative through your activism at that point. But now you're a member of Congress. I mean, I know that, again, in 20 years, 30 years, people will look back at this moment in history and just say, what the hell was going on? But I think
like that now.
Yeah.
So
that exactly what exactly. Many of us have been saying that for many years, like, what the hell is going on? But in particular, when you think about what Congress was doing and now being a member of that distinct community, what goes on for you?
Well, actually, you know what? I'm still working on the same issue. I understood where the elected officials were coming from because they were desperate. In Los Angeles, in 1 year, we had 1,000 homicides. You had community members saying, bring in the army, take away these young people. anything, just bring us relief. Take my Bill of Rights, take my civil liberties. So activists like me were like, no, don't do that. That's not the answer. And so we fought against that and we organized against that to say there is a solution. So the elected officials were responding to their constituents. Now, I absolutely, knew then it was the wrong thing. And we knew mass incarceration was going to come. It was obvious. So here I am 30 years later working on the exact same issues. Now that people have the insight, now we're trying to roll it back. So I'm working on criminal justice reform. I'm working on foster care, because that's the other thing that happened, is that when women started using drugs, because again, it was the first time this happened, we took away the families. And by the way, that description of the woman being arrested because she delivered drugs and cut the umbilical cord, that's still happening. That is still happening. And sometimes the drug is crack and sometimes it's methamphetamine. I mean, that's.
You mean women are
Women are still being arrested for that. There are cases in California. I mean, this was just reported on about 3 weeks ago. Women are still being arrested for that, for delivering drugs to their baby if they were high when they delivered. But back in those times, the biggest thing was to get people to understand that there was a solution, because white folks were still using cocaine, just like they talked about in the beginning of the movie. The difference was that was viewed differently. Like you said, it was white people that were primarily buying crack. So there was a solution, but still fighting for the same issues, but trying to unwind the laws that were passed in the 80s in response to crack. That's my primary reason for wanting to be in Congress.
I think then, we have to say that then, the law was passed in the middle of this that equated, 5 grams of crack with 500 grams of cocaine. So, and then the law was changed. So it was not, the penalty was not for dealing, it was for possession. Right. So people like Susan Burton was arrested 5 times for possession. Not for dealing, not for harming anybody but herself, 5 times for possession, and never offered treatment. And so, that was the deepening and the way that it got more and more insidious and caught up more and more Black and brown people, kind of in that web.
But let me mention one other thing too about the capitalism piece. To me, when I saw the folks dealing, I saw them as being entrepreneurs. So one of the things that we did at Community Coalition was we went and got the drug dealers who had transitioned from illegal to legal. That's how Las Vegas started, right? So, right. Because some of the drug dealers invested in property, they invested in businesses, and we got them to talk to the younger folks to say, you can actually do what you're doing legally. And so it wasn't regarded as a skill. Again, it was something that was punished.
That's very important that you did that, Ms. Bass, because that wasn't people don't realize that selling drugs and getting that money is just as addictive as using it. After I experienced receiving money like that at a young age, I didn't turn my life around until I was 36 years old. I come out and I'm like, I can't be broke. And working for minimum wage and trying to get 2 and 3 jobs where I'm maybe making a third of what the rent would be, it pushes you to go back to doing what you know how to do best, and then you just try to do it smarter, So if you can't replace that with something, that the person is going to keep going back to what he knows how to do best, he or she knows how to.
It's interesting because we talk sometimes about corporate America, with big salaries, that it ends up putting golden handcuffs on you. In this case, they were golden handcuffs for someone like you who was selling, but then they actually ended up also being real handcuffs, right? Because of that. I was wondering, Samson, when you were listening to the Congresswoman talking about, for Congress, or thinking back to those times when Congress was passing these laws, what were you thinking at that point as a young person? Was it just like, one, when the film does show is the corruption that existed with the police, in this case, the NYPD. But what were you thinking at that time?
Most of the time, just thinking about how to be a smarter criminal. It wasn't deterring us at all. As you could see, the numbers went from 300,000 being locked up to 2.2 million. People were still gonna, you know, being harder on crime. That's not stopping someone from going out there and surviving or making money for his family or trying to keep a lifestyle that they're used to. That doesn't deter it at all. It just makes you find ways on how to maneuver around it.
I think what's important too is one of the things, the kind of the way we start the film. We kind of start the film with Ronald Reagan accepting the nomination, and he accepts the nomination by saying, let's make America great again. Which is a great, which is a great clip. And then we talk about how, in the next couple of years, unemployment and poverty, go up, and kind of the government safety nets, are cut one by one. So, in Black and Latinx communities, the people have no jobs. As Congressman Bass said, the industries are fleeing the cities, and so you and then crack comes along, and Samson is probably one of my favorite quotes in the film. He says it was like a gold rush to the hood.
I like that too.
Why not?
Yeah, right. And also you have to understand one of the women in the film, Lulu, says, hey, there were no cops around, so the chance of us getting busted were very little, at least at first.
Right.
In the beginning, there was just, like the Wild Wild West.
Well, I mean, I remember, when we were on 106th Street, and what was the name of the gang? It was young kids, young, like 13, and that was part of their tag. But people who were living in the community, we were like, we know that the people in this community are all cool. What's happening is that everybody knows that the police will never come to this community. And so that's, Samson, then you were like, well, that's the corner we got to stand on, the one that we know the police aren't going to come to. If I called 911 because there was a shootout, I later learned, when finally the police came and I actually had a conversation, they were like, oh, we don't come if you call 911 just once. We got to get a 911 call at least 2 or 3 times before we're going to come here. I remember once I called 911 and I got a recording, and no one will believe those things. And I'm thinking, Stanley, about, and Marsha, about the role of journalists in particular. Like, to me, this is very distressing. The fact that we didn't have, always the issue of representation in our newsrooms has been a real problem. But in regards to crack and how it was covered, and the fervor that leads to someone like Hillary Clinton talking about super predators because of all of the mass imagery, right, that our fellow journalists are using. Talk a little bit more about that part of the story and your decision to really focus on the narrative in the mainstream media around crack.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a huge part of it. We think of it as the crack era for a reason. The crack era, and the reporting on it was just so bad. It's kind of like once the press heard about this thing called crack, it was nuts. There were tons of front page headlines in New York City about 100,000 crack babies that were going to flood the system, and it was the biggest scourge. They talked about it. It's funny, they talked about it as like it was an epidemic and a plague. And now we know what a real epidemic and a real plague is. And so so they, and the reporting was just at first non-existent, then completely overblown and crazy. We talk about the crack baby thing first came from one guy, who did a kind of a terrible report, and that's where the idea of these millions of crack babies across the country came from. So the reporting was just first non-existent, and then when reporters got into it, it was just terrible, and devastating for so many people.
Also, it was very hard to get mainstream journalists who were white to understand the level of potential corruption in the police departments. Samson, can you talk a little bit about your experience? I think right now we're having a whole conversation around policing yet again in our country, vis-a-vis people of color, Black people. But in particular, there's also their role in all of this, in the drug trade. What can you talk to us about what that was like, witnessing? On the one hand, we're being told the police are there to protect, but you're like, no, they're not.
Yeah, the police were opportunists and capitalists as well, and police salary isn't that much. So that's why, that gold rush that came to the hood, it didn't just come to the people that live in these, deprived communities. It also came to the people that's in jobs that's not really, paying them so much. And then they seen an opportunity that's easy for them to be corrupted. It's like, okay, here, I'm gonna pay you this monthly, or I'm gonna give you this to let you know where some big some other bigger players are at, so you could get them out of the way from me, and I keep you on the monthly payroll, and it just corrupted everybody, from like even the ministers, the preachers. They knew where that bag of money is coming from that's getting dipped in by Mrs. Green, whose son runs, this organization over here. Miss Green didn't have that much money last week. Now this week she could put this much in the pot. So it just corrupted the whole community, and the cops weren't excluded from that corruption.
How Samson, what's your story out? You said that it was at 36. I don't know how old you are. You still look like you're 25. So stop. Okay, we can't stand you. But what happened at 36 and that meant that you were in the business for
most of my life. I could say for over 20, maybe 22 years or something like that. As far as in the streets. But what happened was I came home from Fort Dix Correctional Facility, and I asked a friend of mine, how do I get in the music industry? Because that's what I was, going after before I got locked up. And he said, you have to leave the music alone. You got to do film. So I'm like, what I'm going to do with film? And then I said, okay, I know these girls, that I could follow, that fights. And, basically I knew a good story to tell about these girls that grew up where I live at. And I started shooting a trailer, and I ran into Nelson George during that process, and Nelson George said, my friend Reginald Hutland is the president of BET, and I want him to see this trailer. Then from there, they gave Reginald seen it, and he brought me on the BET and gave me a shot at becoming a journalist, and it was on-the-job training, and I never looked back. All I needed was an opportunity. I said, I'm not messing this opportunity up. I have an opportunity to turn my life around and make a living wage. So I just took full advantage of it.
Looks like Maria dropped off.
Yeah, Maria's gone. So
what do we do now? Well, let me say something. There's so many people like you, Samson, and that's the way I viewed the young people that people were trying to throw away. I mean, they had this expression, lost generation. You remember that? How do you lose a generation? What does that even mean?
Right.
and crack babies. You're stigmatizing a newborn child. And hopefully people won't remember, that title. But, I felt like if somebody could find a Samson and say, you've been this, you have these entrepreneurial skills. come on over here, take the money you invested. But wasn't it interesting that they came up with asset forfeiture laws just around that time? So the folks that were making money and were trying to transfer into legitimate economy, they took everything away.
Right, because it's not as if Samson didn't want to work or wasn't prepared to work super hard, 3 times as hard.
He was working.
He was working, is what I'm saying. So there was, because the whole other notion was like, oh, well, they don't work in those communities. And it's like, no, they're working hard. Very, very, very hard. So can we talk a little bit about the connections to today, to what we are seeing today, to how what we lived through during the height of the crack era, and how it is affecting what we're doing today, how we're living today, media today, politics today. Marcia, let me ask you to kind of jump in, because you're very much present in the today as an executive producer, right? What are you thinking in terms of this film, and the connections that we have to be thinking about making today in terms of people of color, Black people, relationships with police, corruption, lies, the government?
Yeah, I mean, I think today of all days, um, Congresswoman Bass knows way better than I. I'm thinking about a lot of those things. I'm thinking about Ronald Reagan and how, he became this singular figure on the right. He became this, lionized guy, after whom we name airports. When actually he did a lot of really bad things, set a lot of really horrible things in motion. And in a lot of ways, I think you can draw a straight line from Reagan's inauguration to what happened today. In many ways, but in terms of the role that the extent that the government's willing to go to lie, especially when you're talking about people of color, the kind of denial of responsibility, the inequitable treatment on the health side, which we see today, on the criminal justice side, which couldn't be clearer. So, I'm always proud of the work that we do at Firelight. I'm always proud of it, but it feels cosmic to have this film come out this week, when we're dealing with all that we're dealing with.
The other cosmic part of it for me is, and thank you, of course, you couldn't not tell this part of the story, but the relationship of Central America.
Mhm.
So when you think about what this outgoing person, can we even call him a president, Trump, what he's done in terms of the refugee caravans, these are people coming from Central America. These are the countries that the United States was in, that they were destabilizing in order to try to sell, to get the money to provide the arms. So everything goes back to, not everything, but in this particular moment where, as a journalist, I'm reporting about Central American refugees every day. Every day. And people are like, oh, what, Central America? That's new. It's like, no, in the 80s, do you remember Nicaragua, the Contras? And so thank you so much for making that particular connection. Stanley, I'm not sure if you wanted to chime in a little bit about that. To me, the Central America thing is like, please, bells and whistles going off. This is another legacy. In our communities, we're still dealing with the pain and the incarceration. But in Central America, the legacy from the destabilization of the Contras and all of this illegal activity is people seeking refuge, ultimately.
Yeah, I'll be really short because I want to hear from Congresswoman Bass on this. But as you were talking and Michael was talking, I was just thinking, for the first time probably ever, that one of the things about the whole Iran Contra scandal and the kind of triangular trade that we talk about in the film, which echoes the slave trade, but that that the United States just used two really small countries, Iran and Nicaragua, to get their own ends, and really just use them, and then devastated communities in this country. But I want to hear from Congresswoman Bass, because I think that
Agreed.
I think I saw you jotting down something. So
Oh.
She's taking notes.
Yes, I was. Well, when you raise Central America, I mean, I'm from Los Angeles. So when people were fleeing in the middle of the civil wars, we were all active in that too, the solidarity movement. And every time I would hear 45 talk about Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, we created that. MS-13 started in Los Angeles, California. We deported them to El Salvador, and they took the drugs. I mean, that was something that we destabilized them, and then destabilized them again by deporting the folks. And so it is all connected. And then it comes to where we are now, where we're dealing with the folks coming back here, but we don't take any responsibility. We don't address the root causes. But one thing I want to say about Reagan that's kind of ironic, not only did he attack welfare, and that was code for Black women, but he also began the process of what I say, which is defunding our communities. People talk about defunding the police. He started the defunding of our communities by rolling back all of the social services, by block granting it, and then the communities were left with nothing. And then you have not just industry leaving, but you wonder why you have drugs that go in, and you don't have the resources for drug treatment. You don't have the jobs, so you don't address the root causes. What you do is that you take these problems and you criminalize them. And so now, 30 years later, we're trying to unwind all of that, and it has created an absolute mess.
So, Samson, I'm wondering, there's somebody who I knew, actually, a kid I went to high school with, and I went to a fancy private high school in Chicago, and he ended up becoming a drug dealer, major scale, white guy. May he rest in peace. Anyway, at one point, he told me he was a drug dealer, massive drug dealer, a lot of pot growing. But then we were having a conversation at some kind of high school reunion. He was like, "Oh no, who was selling me cocaine was Oliver North." And I just remember just like saying, "Oh my God," because he didn't know at that time, he's just this guy named Oliver North. And of course, by then, and I'm just wondering, Samson, any kind of memories that you have, we're talking about the relationship between, poverty and destabilization in our communities here, tied to poverty and destabilization in Central America. What kinds of connections were you making, or are you making now?
Oh, now, oh man, being a storyteller, I mean, God bless me, man, because the work that I've done in my 16 years now of being a journalist. I mean, I got policemen that's my best friends. They text me all the time. We do things together, and I said, who would have thought I'd be cool with a cop like this? You know what I'm saying? And I have like Mayor Raj Baraka on speed dial, and just the amount of trust that I have, that I gained from the streets. Because one thing that I took all the positive stuff that I did learn from the streets, which is there's a lot of morals and standards and honor. Because if you didn't carry those characteristics out, you get a bullet in your head. Plain and simple. That's just what it was. You lied, you said you're going to do something, you don't do it, you may wind up dead. So, I carry those same characteristics with me, and it's like the good people, they attract to that. And I have a diverse range of friends now because of it. So I'm just blessed, man. And just to work on this, and for, Stanley and, Marsha to give me this opportunity, and Keith Brown, and just to see the journalist community embrace me regardless of my past, and showing me how I can use my experiences to be able to give a perspective that's like unique. It's just a blessing, and I teach classes now to young people, at-risk youth to show them that they also can change their life by storytelling.
Thank you, because what we need is more journalists, and we need more storytellers. I mean, we need more reporters. And I'm just thinking, if these young people had been in the newsrooms of the New York Times or the Washington Post, maybe they could have stopped some of this incorrect coverage and incorrect narratives that were being put out there. So we really are glad that you made it out onto the other side, Samson. And yeah.
Thank you.
I just want to add something that I don't want to skip it over it, but one of the things we talk about in the film too, besides the lead up to mass incarceration, is also the militarization of the police, in the name of the war on drugs, and the pouring of money into the police, where all of a sudden the police have tanks and battering rams, and I think a lot of us first saw it in Ferguson, where the police have tanks, and we're like, wait, what are the police doing with tanks? And they're wearing body armor. We saw it in the summer when young people were marching, to protest the murder of George Floyd, and the cops are wearing body armor like something out of Star Wars, and that's something that kind of was led to directly from the war on drugs, and kind of had its basis in the crack epidemic, where everybody was saying, okay, you got to stop this, and I don't think it's abnormal, for the community to say, that the police let it get so bad that the community just said, okay, okay, your idea is to lock them up, put them away, do something, because I can't go out at night. I'm scared to walk home. That's not, as Congresswoman Beth said over and over, I mean, that's not the situation. I mean the solution. That's not the solution that we want. But it gets to that place.
One of the things that I'm thinking a lot about in terms of the long legacy is mass incarceration and what's happening. Mass incarceration was understood then that also, to use Sampson's terms, could become another form of a gold rush, right? So mass incarceration leads to the private prison industry.
Right.
And most people are just like, what are you talking about? The crack epidemic is tied to that too, right? So that people now realize they can make money off of keeping people behind bars. And now you have the push for to stop mass incarceration. But what that is leading to is, so who's being held now? Actually, immigrants, right? They're the ones who are now being held and making the money for the private prison industry, because activists, rightly so, have pushed, and the pressure is on to stop mass incarceration. But it just feels like in our country there is this constant whack-a-mole, and that it was crack dealers who were the enemy, or it was drugs that was the enemy, it was Muslims that are the enemy, it's the immigrants who are the enemies, it's MS-13 who's the enemy. It's like, how do we, and precisely in this moment as we're starting 2021, and we're thinking about taking on hate, this does feel like a particularly desperate time in that sense. Congresswoman, as we begin to wind down our conversation, can you talk a little bit about, you kind of lived through it straight up right there recently because of an attempted coup on the Capitol. So how do we continue to hold those accountable and have hope?
Well, for me, yeah, I'm in Congress now, but I'm a lifelong activist and organizer, and organizing is what gives me hope. And I have tremendous hope right now because we have a whole generation of activists. Look what they did with Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is known all over the world. The Congressional Black Caucus, we did an hour-long call with all 27 ambassadors of the European Union, because they're coming into this racial reckoning and they're looking back, at colonialism. But I do want to comment about what you were saying about the private prisons, because I don't think that stopped. And mass incarceration has absolutely not stopped. I do think that we have the basis now to begin to reform, undo some of the damage that was done from before, but we're not there just yet. The problem in the United States, and one of the fundamental problems, is we monetize everything. We've monetized poverty. We monetize by privatizing prisons. We monetize that. There was a lawsuit that a private prison company in Arizona filed a couple of years ago because their census had gone down. They didn't have enough prisoners. And so, we do have the basis to make those changes now. But because we spent so many years incarcerating people, we actually now need to create an entire layer of services to take care of those people once they get out. That's some of the legislation that I'm working on. Susan Burton is a perfect example of that, but we need about 10,000 Susan Burtons around the country to create programs to help reintegrate people back into communities.
So, Samson, what is giving you a sense of hope? You're a survivor now, but we have particular challenges now in our communities. There is a tremendous amount of poverty because of the pandemic, our communities being hardest hit. What's giving you hope again, as a journalist and as a storyteller now, after you've made all of these connections?
What's giving me hope is that a lot of people that's not being spoken about is making changes in the community. There are a lot of people that's on the ground, their feet are on the ground, they curbing violence. When you see these politicians, some politicians, they say, oh, we brought this crime down, but it's actually because of the people that's doing the grass,
right?
The grass, work that's on the ground. So I'm in touch with them by storytelling, and then also, I decide to pick which one because like right now, I'm on the board of it's called the Brownsville Think Tank Matters, and we helping in that Brownsville section, which I once was a problem at. So, there's a lot of people that's giving back like that are respected, and it's treated like a disease. When you find an antidote, you have to inject the person with the actual disease, but it's just a dormant disease. It's not active. And the same thing we do. We go in there dormant. We was once active, and now we dormant, and we can understand and be able to make changes within the community. So I see a lot of that going on nationwide. That's maybe not being broadly publicized, but Congresswoman Cameron Bash, you're shaking your head. This.
I do.
So that gives me hope because people are stepping up. They're just not getting the publicity. They're not getting the publicity for it, but it is happening. So that gives me hope.
Thank you so much, and which is why we're so thankful to have Marsha in our midst, and Stanley as well. As you can see the clock, we've got 2 minutes before we got to wrap up. So Stanley, Marsha, your final thoughts and a little bit maybe what's giving you hope.
I want to say first, watch Crack on Netflix.
Yeah. Again.
I mean, I can't believe that all the things we talked about are in the film, and there's so much in that film.
It's an amazing film. Watch it.
So please watch it. But I kept thinking about as we were talking, Congressman Bass and Congresswoman Bass and Samson, about Georgia. I mean, it's been overshadowed by the craziness of Trump in the last weeks, but Trump has been impeached, but Georgia. I mean, when they said there was going to be a runoff, in Georgia, I thought, okay, well, no way, there is no way, but it's changing, and the country is changing, and I'm very hopeful. I think that I'm very hopeful, and because we have power, and we do have power. We just have to take it. We just have to take the power that we have and use it.
Marsha, you have a curmudgeon-y husband, and he's hopeful. This is a good thing.
Wait a minute.
We you were arguing. He said no. I said yes. No. Yes. Stanley said exactly what I was going to say. I think, the upside of this period is that a new generation is stepping into their power, and it's all to the good, despite all the resistance and the noise, which is substantial. it's happening.
Yeah, it's
I agree.
but we got some fighters. You know, we
Yeah.
got young people who you know, I have real like admiration and trust for young people, man. You know, they're fighters.
And a next generation of journalists and storytellers and filmmakers and members of Congress. Who knows? So thank you so much to all of you for joining us. You must watch the film. It's Crack, Corruption. What is it?
Crack, cocaine, corruption, and conspiracy.
There, hello. It's on Netflix. Please watch. I want to say thank you so much to Congressmember Karen Bass on such an auspicious night after having voted to impeach the president for the second time. To the person who I'm most happy to meet tonight, Samson Styles. You've given me just all kinds of hope, and I can't wait to work with you. I want to hear all about what you're doing, and you must come and visit Futuro Media in Harlem when we're back in the office. um, to my dear friend Marcia Smith, thank you so much for all that you do, and Stanley Nelson for leading the way for so many of us. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. And yeah, 92Y confronts hate. We just tried to add to that conversation. Have a great